Every night, people go online and share stories they were too afraid to tell in real life. Stories that started completely normal. An empty road at midnight, a cheap house with a strange history, a text from an unknown number, or soft footsteps outside a bedroom door at 3 a.m. But the terrifying part is, these aren't movie scripts. They aren't made-up horror stories for entertainment. These stories were posted on Reddit by people who swear every word actually happened to them. So, I recommend watching this video from beginning to end. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Let's begin. Alice was a journalist who was always searching for strange stories spreading across the internet, and one night she heard about something called the left-right game. It was said that anyone who entered the game might never return at first. She did not believe it, but then she met a man named Rob. His face was pale and his eyes were filled with fear. He told her he had entered the game before and lost people inside it, and that the roads in the game were not normal roads, but places humans were never meant to reach. Alice agreed to join a small group to try the game, and they left late at night in 2 cars on a long, empty highway. Everything felt normal at first, but after hours things slowly started to change. Road signs disappeared, the radio turned into static, and even the clock stopped moving. Everyone felt as if time itself had frozen. Then they passed through a small silent town. There were no cars, no people, only old houses glowing from inside. As they drove closer, they noticed figures standing behind the windows, smiling silently. Their smiles were long and unnatural, as if their faces were not human. Rob warned them not to look at them, but one member of the group kept staring until he started shaking violently and returned to the car without saying another word. They continued driving, and soon they heard soft knocking sounds on the windows, even though the road outside was completely empty. The next night they saw an old school bus parked on the side of the road. It was filled with children sitting perfectly still, but when they got closer they realized the children had no faces, only dark empty holes where their eyes and mouths should have been. One of the group members tried to leave, but Rob screamed and told him there was no way back anymore. The deeper they traveled, the stranger the roads became. The sky turned dark red, the gas never ran out, and maps stopped working completely. Then they saw a very tall man standing in the middle of the road. His body was unnaturally thin, and when the car passed him, his neck slowly twisted toward them. Then he started running after the car faster than the car itself. He laughed while chasing them, and his laughter sounded inhuman. 2 people disappeared that same night without a trace. Alice began to feel the place changing their minds. One person started talking to people who were not there, while another stared into the darkness for hours. Without moving, Rob finally admitted the truth. He had entered the game years ago because he lost his brother there and had been trying to find him ever since. After many days, they reached a dark tunnel, and when they drove through it, all the lights vanished. They could feel something moving around them in the darkness, and whispers began calling their names. When they finally came out of the tunnel, they found themselves in a dead city beneath a black sky with no sun and no moon. Buildings were filled with moving shadows behind the windows. Alice finally understood that the game was not a game at all, but another world. Entirely a place you could enter by mistake but never truly escape. Every road led them back to the same place no matter how far they drove, and they could hear the tall man laughing everywhere even when he was nowhere to be seen. In the end, Rob disappeared too, and Alice was left alone driving endlessly through the dark roads while voices whispered beside her, telling her she would never return to the real world again. Nathan had recently moved into a cheap apartment building in a small American city after getting a new job, and at first, everything seemed normal. The building was old and quiet, but the rent was low and he did not mind living alone. The landlord was an elderly woman who acted nervous whenever anyone mentioned apartment 14C at the end of the hallway. One evening, Nathan casually asked her why nobody lived there, and she immediately became pale before warning him never to knock on the door no matter what he heard at night. Nathan laughed because he assumed the apartment was abandoned and the woman was simply superstitious. During his first week, strange things started happening. Every night around 2 a.m. he heard slow footsteps moving down the hallway outside his apartment, followed by 3 knocks coming from somewhere nearby. At first he ignored it, but the sounds continued every single night, always at the exact same time. One night, curiosity got the better of him, and he looked through the peephole after hearing the footsteps. A tall man was standing motionless outside apartment 14C. His back faced the hallway and his head tilted slightly downward as if staring at the floor. Nathan waited for the man to move, but he remained completely still for almost 10 minutes before slowly turning toward Nathan's door. Nathan jumped back from the peephole, breathing heavily because for a brief second he thought the man had looked directly at him through the door. The next morning he asked another tenant about the strange man, but the neighbor immediately became uncomfortable and claimed nobody had lived on that floor for years. He also admitted people sometimes heard knocking sounds at night, but warned Nathan never to open his door after 2 a.m. The following night, Nathan tried recording the noises with his phone at exactly 2 a.m. The footsteps returned slower and heavier than before. Then came the knocking, 3 loud knocks directly on his apartment door. His entire body froze because this time the sounds were much closer than usual. He checked the peephole again and nearly screamed. The tall man was now standing directly outside his apartment, staring straight ahead. His skin looked pale gray and unnaturally stretched across his face, and his eyes were completely black. Nathan quietly stepped away from the door, but then his phone vibrated in his hand. A new voicemail had appeared, even though nobody had called him. When he played it, he heard only static followed by his own voice whispering, "Do not let him inside." The power suddenly went out across the entire building. The hallway outside became completely dark except for a faint red emergency light at the far end. Nathan heard the man outside begin scratching slowly against the door. The scratching continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Then came a soft voice from outside, sounding exactly like Nathan's mother, asking him to open the door because she needed help. Nathan knew it was impossible because his mother lived hundreds of miles away, but the voice sounded perfect, exactly like her, this time sounding like his dead brother, laughing softly outside the apartment. Nathan backed away in terror while the knocking started again, louder than before. Suddenly he heard another apartment door open somewhere down the hallway, followed by a terrified scream that ended almost instantly. Silence filled the building for several seconds before heavy footsteps began dragging something across the floor outside Nathan's door. He could hear wet dragging sounds moving slowly toward apartment 14C. After what felt like hours, the power finally returned and the hallway became quiet again. The next morning, Nathan opened his door carefully and noticed a long trail of dark stains leading toward apartment 14C. One of the neighboring apartments was now completely empty, and the tenant who lived there was gone without explanation. Nathan decided to leave the building immediately, but when he confronted the landlord, she finally admitted the truth. Years ago, a man living in apartment 14C murdered several tenants before killing himself inside the apartment. After his death, residents began hearing knocking at night, and people who opened their doors after 2 a.m. were never seen again. Nathan packed his belongings and left that same evening, relieved to finally escape, but several weeks later, while staying in a different city, he woke up at exactly 2 a.m. to the sound of slow footsteps outside his new apartment. Then came 3 soft knocks on the door, followed by a familiar voice whispering, "Nathan, let me in." Mark worked the night shift at an old forest ranger station deep in the mountains of a remote American state. His job was simple: Watch the security cameras answer. Emergency calls from hikers and stay inside until sunrise. At first he thought the job would be boring, but he needed the money, so he kept working there. On his first night, the station manager handed him an old notebook and said, "Never go outside after midnight, no matter what you hear, and if something in the forest calls your name, do not answer." Mark laughed because he thought it was just an old ghost story meant to scare new workers. The first few nights were quiet, but on the fifth night the radio suddenly filled with static. Then he heard a woman crying somewhere deep in the woods, begging for help. He tried to trace the signal, but it kept moving unnaturally fast between the trees. He grabbed his flashlight and went outside, even though he had been warned not to. The deeper he walked into the forest, the louder the crying became, until he finally found an old wooden cabin hidden between the trees, a cabin that did not appear on any map. He slowly walked toward it and knocked on the door. The crying stopped instantly, then a low voice from inside whispered, "Come in if you are alone." A cold feeling spread through his body and he stepped back, but then he noticed small children's footprints surrounding the cabin. Even though that area had supposedly been abandoned for years, he slowly opened the door and found the room completely empty except for a rocking chair moving by itself. In the corner were old family photographs, but every face in the pictures had been violently scratched out. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him and his flashlight died. The room became completely dark. Then he heard footsteps circling around him, followed by the sound of children laughing and distorted voices. He tried opening the door, but it would not move. A second later, the flashlight flickered back on, and for one horrifying moment he saw a tall man standing at the far end of the room. His head nearly touched the ceiling, and his face had no eyes, only an unnaturally wide smile stretching across his skin. Mark screamed and threw himself against the door. Finally forcing it open, he ran through the woods until he reached the ranger station. Again, when he entered, he noticed every security monitor was showing the same image, the cabin from different camera angles, even though there were no cameras anywhere near that place. What terrified him even more was seeing himself standing in front of the cabin on one of the live screens, even though he was already back inside the station. Panicking, he shut the monitors off, but the radio suddenly came alive again. This time the voice speaking through the static sounded exactly like the station manager. It had whispered, "You should never have entered the cabin." Over the next few nights things became worse. Mark heard knocking on the station windows, saw shadows moving between the trees, and sometimes noticed pale faces staring at him from the darkness before disappearing. Every morning he found muddy footprints inside the station, even though the doors had been locked all night. One night he woke up to heavy footsteps walking across the roof, followed by a long scratching sound as if something was trying to claw its way inside. Mark tried quitting the job, but the manager refused and told him every worker who stayed there long enough eventually started seeing the same things, and most of them disappeared after a few weeks. When Mark demanded to know what was really living in the forest, the manager only stared at him silently before saying the forest does not let people leave once it knows their name. That same night the power went out completely. The station fell into darkness, and outside he could hear dozens of voices whispering his name from the woods. Then came the sound of children laughing again, followed by slow footsteps approaching the front door. Mark grabbed a shotgun from the emergency locker and pointed it toward the entrance. The knocking started softly at first, then became violent. The entire station shook with every hit. Finally, the door slowly creaked open by itself. Standing outside was the same tall, eyeless man from the cabin, smiling wider than before. Behind him, between the trees, stood dozens of motionless figures watching silently. Mark raised the shotgun, but before he could fire, the lights suddenly came back on. Everything outside was gone. The door was closed, and the forest was completely silent. The next morning, another ranger arrived for his shift and found the station empty. The cameras were still recording, but every screen showed only dark trees and endless fog. Mark was never seen again, but some rangers who work there today still claim that late at night they sometimes hear a man's voice on the radio begging for help deep in the forest far beyond the trees where no human should be alive anymore. Ethan had always loved driving at night because the empty highways made him feel calm and free. And after graduating college, he accepted a job delivering medical supplies between small towns across the American Midwest. The routes were long, lonely, and usually passed through forests, mountains, and abandoned roads where there were barely any gas stations for miles. Most drivers hated the night routes, but Ethan preferred them because he enjoyed the silence during his second month on the job. Another driver named Carl warned him about a stretch of highway known as Route Blackwood. Carl told him that drivers sometimes disappeared there without explanation, and those who returned often refused to talk about what they saw. Ethan laughed and assumed it was just another small town horror story invented to scare new workers. A few nights later, Ethan received an emergency delivery assignment that required him to drive through Blackwood Forest during a thunderstorm. The rain was heavy and visibility was terrible, but the GPS kept insisting it was the fastest route. About an hour into the Powhatan drive, Ethan noticed something strange. Every road sign suddenly looked old, rusted, and faded, as if they had been abandoned for decades. Then his radio stopped playing music and turned into loud static, followed by a woman whispering his name. He immediately switched stations, but every frequency carried the same whisper. Ethan tried calling dispatch, but his phone displayed no signal, even though it had been working perfectly minutes earlier. As he continued driving, the storm somehow became completely silent. There was still lightning flashing across the sky, but he could no longer hear rain, thunder, or even the sound of his own engine. It felt as if the world itself had gone mute. Then he saw a hitchhiker standing on the side of the road, a pale woman wearing a white dress soaked by rain. Her face was hidden by long black hair, and one of her arms bent at an unnatural angle. Ethan slowed down for a moment, but remembered Carl's warning and drove past her. A few minutes later, he froze in terror because the woman was standing beside the road, again farther ahead, as if she had somehow moved miles ahead of him without a vehicle. This time her head slowly turned toward the truck as he passed, and he briefly saw her face. Her eyes were completely black and her mouth stretched into a smile far too wide for a human face. Ethan slammed the gas pedal and sped down the highway while trying not to look in the mirrors. Then the GPS screen suddenly changed. Instead of showing the road, it displayed only one message, repeated over and over: turn back before they see you. Ethan tried shutting it off, but the message remained on the screen. Even after he unplugged the device, his headlights flickered, and for a split second, he saw dozens of figures standing silently between the trees on both sides of the road, watching the truck pass. None of them moved. After another hour, Ethan spotted an old gas station glowing faintly in the darkness and decided to stop for help. The station looked abandoned from outside, but the lights inside were on. When he entered, he found an old cashier staring at him silently without blinking. Ethan asked for directions back to the highway, but the man ignored the question and instead asked, "You saw her, didn't you?" Ethan felt cold. Fear spread through his chest. The cashier explained that many years earlier a woman had died on that road during a storm after crashing her car while trying to escape something in the woods. Since then, drivers who saw her often vanished before sunrise. Ethan tried leaving immediately, but discovered his truck would not start no matter how many times he turned the key. Cashier calmly told him it was all ready, too late, and advised him not to go outside until midnight. Then he locked the station doors and shut off all the lights except one near the counter. Hours passed in silence until Ethan heard scratching sounds coming from outside the building. He carefully looked through the window and nearly screamed. The pale woman was slowly circling the gas station, dragging her broken arm behind her, while dozens of dark human shapes stood motionless near the trees behind her. The scratching became pounding, then came the sound of voices outside whispering Ethan's name from every direction. The cashier finally spoke again and admitted that the creatures in the forest were not ghosts, but something older, something that copied voices and memories to lure people outside. He revealed that he himself had been trapped in the gas station for nearly 20 years because once the forest marked someone, it never truly let them leave. At exactly midnight, the pounding stopped completely. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. Then the cashier suddenly looked terrified. For the first time, he whispered, "They're inside." The lights began flickering violently, and Ethan heard footsteps moving through the aisles behind him, even though nobody was there. One by one, the shelves started falling over on their own, while distorted laughter echoed from the darkness. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and ran toward the back exit, but froze when he saw dozens of muddy footprints appearing on the floor ahead of him as if invisible. People were walking toward him. In the beam of the flashlight, he finally saw them, tall, thin figures with pale skin and hollow black eyes standing silently in the darkness. Their mouths slowly opened wider and wider until their jaws split unnaturally down their necks. Ethan ran outside into the storm and jumped into his truck. Somehow the engine finally started. He sped onto the highway while the creatures emerged from the trees behind him, moving impossibly fast. Some crawled across the road on all fours, while others ran upright without making any sound. The pale woman appeared directly in the middle of the highway, forcing Ethan to swerve violently. His truck crashed through a guardrail and rolled down an embankment. When Ethan regained consciousness, the storm was gone and daylight filled the forest. Police officers were pulling him from the wreckage. They told him he was lucky to be alive because his truck had crashed nearly 3 days earlier. Ethan tried explaining what happened, but the officers exchanged nervous looks and avoided answering his questions. Then Ethan noticed something horrifying. One of the officers standing nearby had completely black eyes for just a second before blinking normally again. After the accident, Ethan quit his job and moved across the country, hoping to forget everything, but the nightmares never stopped. Sometimes late at night, he still hears scratching outside his apartment door, followed by a woman whispering his name, and whenever he looks through the peephole, he sees someone standing at the far end of the hallway, smiling with a mouth far too wide to belong to any human being.